All right, in other parts of our lecture on Chapter 21, we've looked at the outbreak of the war, the initial American neutrality in the war, and then we spent quite a bit of time looking at how the course of the war and the American involvement is going to change things on the American home front with some pretty long-term consequences. The purpose of this video is the beginning of actually a set of a couple of videos where we're looking at the course of the war itself and how the outcome of the war is going to have an impact not just for the United States, but really for Europe and the rest of the world as well. All right, let's get things situated so far as our time and space is concerned for the war in Europe. So I know I've got a couple of things up here note-wise, but let's get attention over to the map first and foremost. This is the same map we were looking at back in 1914 when the war broke out, with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria here in the middle, and with the Allied forces, the UK, France, and Russia, on the Triple Entente or the Allied powers for us once the war is moving. So the course of events in Russia are really what's going to sort of speed up the last phase of the war. By October 1917, the Russian Revolution has entered its second phase, and it is becoming the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist revolution that is going to have many consequences on the history of the world. But as the most immediate consequences are concerned is the new communist leaders in Russia and the Soviet Union. They are very interested in getting out of World War I as soon as possible. So when the Russian Revolution starts in October 1917, there's a little bit of chaos going on the Eastern Front of the war so far as what the actual intent and what the consequences are going to be for the course of the war. By the time you get to March of 1918, in March, the Russians, the new Soviet Union, they are negotiating a peace treaty with Germany that is basically going to withdraw the Russian forces from the fighting lines in World War I. And so when this happens, you might remember we talked about how the German army is getting pulled in two directions through the bulk of the war, because they're fighting against the French and the British on the Western Front, and they have been also fighting against the Russians on the Eastern Front. Well, now that Russia is vacating the war, all of these Eastern Front German troops now have the opportunity to move to the west. And so in the spring of 1918, there is a huge influx of German soldiers and military activity that is pushing into northern France with the ultimate goal of capturing Paris, which is just about here. This places the U.S. Army kind of in the front lines of this last phase of the war, because the U.S. has only been in the war for the matter of like less than a year by the time that this change begins to happen. And so attention turns towards General John J. Pershing, who is the leader of the American Expeditionary Force. The AEF is the given name for the U.S. Army in this overseas fight. If you think about it, the United States has not really ever seen a long-term war in anything other than the boundaries of the United States. And so this expeditionary force has the sole purpose of defending American interests in this European expedition. Pershing, as the leader of this, is kind of instrumental to the war effort in a couple of ways. Firstly, in the months leading up to the Western Front, with the Russian forces, the German forces moving from the Russian front to the Western Front, Pershing has been instrumental in kind of like delaying an American deployment of troops for a while, because once he gets into Europe and he sees the actual outlay of the front lines, Pershing is encouraging a delay in getting these young American soldiers sent to the front lines because he understands they need to get more training. So in the months of training that go on between the fall into the winter of 1917 and out of the spring of 1918, Pershing's men are going to really kind of at the first phases be in support of British and French troops that are there, but ultimately they're going to get their own division and get their own command of troops down here on the French-Swiss border, kind of working back up this way towards like that northern coast of France. And so the change on this is going to be felt so far as these later phases are concerned. The fighting on the Western Front intensifies from the late spring into the early summer of 1918 in what really amounts to the last German offensive of the war. The goal for the German strategists on this is to make a push from this ongoing trench warfare just about here at Soissons and try to continue the push, and ultimately they want to capture Paris, which is only about 45 miles away from what's happening here. They feel like with the extra addition of troops from the Eastern Front, in addition to the technological push that they're trying to achieve, that they will be able to do this. The problem is they kind of run into a set of American troops combined with the British and the French, but these American troops they're not war weary just yet. And so the turnabout that comes into play here is got a couple of different names depending on which angle you're looking at it from. Sometimes it's just referred to as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which is the general attack that's being made, counterattack by the American allied forces to push things back to the east. That's what these blue arrows are really showing here. But sometimes it's kind of referred to as the Battle of the Argonne Forest. All of this is really the Battle of the Argonne Forest. But the smaller locations here at Cantigny, Belleau Wood, Chateau Thierry, these are all like individual battles of really what's kind of taking place over the course of several months, pushing through the summer into the early fall. And a couple of like distinguishable events to take place in here between Chateau Thierry and Saint Mihiel. Sorry for my bad French pronunciation on this, but then this is where the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry, is going to distinguish themselves as they're pushing the German troops further back to like ultimately where the Armistice line is going to be found. Also notable, if for no other reason than for like sheer valor and maybe even like a reference on a star test, you've got people like Sergeant Alvin York. Sergeant York, he's going to win the Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor in action right here in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and like the date of his battle-worthy efforts is October 8th, so it's in the last phases of the war. But part of his regiment is pinned down. He makes an individual effort and attacks a machine gun position. He is successful with that. And through the course of his actions on his own, he is gonna, he's credited with kills of 25 German soldiers and the capture of 132 others, kind of single-handedly, which is phenomenal and kind of hard to believe, but this is in fact true. Maybe it's in part true because by the time you get to October 1918, the will of the German soldiers to keep fighting is starting to break. And as you go from October into November, this is where the front lines of the fight really starts to get into like the edge of German territory. And by November 11th, the Germans are going to surrender. When that surrender happens, it is kind of an unexpected step in a lot of ways, that there is such an ongoing 4 years worth, 4.5 years almost worth of war raging on in this one part of northern France, that when the armistice, when the ceasefire is put in place, it is kind of an unexpected uneasiness that's coming into play. But in the long run, the ceasefire here is going to hold. It's worth pointing out that this surrender and this ceasefire is just a ceasefire. It is not a peace treaty that ends the war. This is just an agreement to stop fighting. And from a lot of perspectives, from a lot of individual perspectives, this is the most notable event for the conclusion of the war, which is why November 11th was regarded as a holiday known as Armistice Day up until the middle of the 1950s, when Congress expanded its role of a holiday to commemorate the veterans of American wars. And so this is Veterans Day, and this is the origins of Veterans Day, where at 11 a.m. on November 11th, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the fighting in the war stopped. And then attention can get turned to how to achieve peace in a conflict that in some ways was really supposed to be the war to end all wars.